Today, the consumer squeeze is on. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. In today's show, we look at the pressures building on UK households as the latest CPI result, which came out overnight, was higher than anticipated, causing economists to revise their outlooks higher yet. And this is yet another indicator that the supply chain disruptions, the pressure on oil prices thanks to the Ukraine conflict, and of course the massive QE programs and ultra-low interest rates imposed by central banks are all taking their toll. I want to make 2 points here. First, with inflation running rampant, central banks will have to raise their benchmark rates, even though there is only an indirect link between interest rates and supply chain disruptions by dampening demand. And second, the consumer is already feeling the pain which was building before the Ukraine conflict, although politicians and central banks are now blaming the war for pretty much everything. The seeds have been laid over the past 10 years. And while we can debate whether this is driven by a set of policy errors or a deliberate strategy to drive in a new financial order, the real-world consequences are already profound. For example, as The Guardian reported, growth in UK retail sales slowed last month as fears over the rising cost of living led to the sharpest drop in consumer confidence since the 2008 financial crisis. The British Retail Consortium said total sales rose by 3.1% in March, compared with the same month a year earlier, significantly down on the 6.7% increase in February. Comparing March with the same month in 2019, that was before the COVID pandemic. Total sales rose by 5.4% as retailers warned rising inflation was beginning to hurt consumer spending. Helen Dickinson, the chief executive of the BRC, said it was likely that strength in the total value of retail sales reflected the surge in prices rather than a rush by consumers back to the shops after the easing of pandemic restrictions. The rising cost of living and the ongoing war in Ukraine has shaken consumer confidence, with expectations of people's personal finances over the next 12 months reaching depths not seen since the 2008 financial crisis, she said. Sales at the Co-op's food business fell by 2% to £9.1 billion, despite the group investing £140 million in opening 50 new stores and refitting 87. Ultimately, consumers face an enormous challenge this year, and this is likely to be reflected in retail spend in the future. The latest snapshot, compiled by the retail industry, showed a rise in spending on beauty and fashion items before Mother's Day, that was the 27th of March, while the fact that people were gradually returning to town and city centres was leading to an uptick in demand for clothes. But spending on food dropped by 6.1%, possibly due to a later Easter compared with the year earlier, and as consumers returned to eating out in restaurants and pubs after the Omicron variant had weighed on demand. Susan Barrett, the chief executive of the research organisation IGD, said the prospect of soaring prices has driven consumer confidence below levels last seen in December 2013, when the horse meat scandal rocked the food industry. These challenges affect shoppers in different ways, with household cutbacks seeing less affluent shoppers skipping meals to save money, she said. This volatile time is set to continue as the reality of the energy price increase as well as general inflation hits home for shoppers. And separate figures from Barclaycard showed consumer card spending rose by 17.7% in March, largely caused by an increase in fuel and food prices as households come under mounting pressure from living costs. Barclaycard, that's the UK's biggest credit card provider, processed nearly half of all transactions and said shoppers were buying in bulk to save money, with many stocking up on non-perishable items and household supplies. With petrol and diesel prices hitting a record high after Russia's invasion of Ukraine drove up global energy markets, it said spending on fuel rose by a massive 26.1%. In response to high prices, surveys on behalf of the car provider showed 41% of people were changing the way they travel, including walking and cycling more and cutting back on longer car journeys. Josie Carvalho, head of consumer products at Barclaycard, said rising fuel prices and household bills are clearly starting to influence consumer behaviour, with many Brits changing their travel and shopping habits to save money. While this may dampen growth in the months ahead, we shouldn't overlook the expected heatwave later in April and the Easter holidays, both of which are likely to boost non-essential spending. Now let's look in more detail at the UK inflation, because the CPI surged to a 30-year high of 7% last month, intensifying a cost of living crisis that threatens to derail the economic recovery. Consumer prices rose by 1.1% in March alone. That's the fastest increase on record for that month, and it adds to pressure on the government and the Bank of England to act, with prices set to surge further this month when a 54% increase in energy costs hit household bills. Inflation is now a major danger for businesses, consumers and Prime Minister Boris Johnson's administration. Tesco plc, the UK's largest supermarket, warned that it faces a battle to keep prices low and could see a hit to profit this year. The Bank of England sees inflation hitting 8% in the coming months and is expected to raise interest rates again on May the 5th. Today's reading underlines the severity of the squeeze on our finances this year, said Ed Monk, Associate Director at fund manager Fidelity International. British households are getting poorer in real terms, and many face having to cut back on anything that isn't essential spending. Economists and charities united in calling on Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak to do more to help households struggling to make ends meet, saying his latest aid package won't help many of the families on the lowest incomes. March's reading is the last before the Bank of England's next meeting, when policymakers will update forecasts, and it marks the 6th straight month of inflation exceeding economists' estimates. So Britain's cost of living crisis will continue to worsen before it starts to ease, perhaps sometime next year, said Jack Leslie, a senior economist at the Resolution Foundation. That's a research group campaigning against poverty. The sheer scale of this inflation-led squeeze on living standards makes it all the more remarkable how little support the Chancellor provided in his spring statement. In a statement on Wednesday, Sunak said we're seeing rising costs caused by global pressures on our supply chains and energy markets, which could be exacerbated further by Russian aggression in Ukraine. I know this is a worrying time for many families, which is why we are taking action to ease the burdens. The acceleration was driven by a broad increase in prices across the economy, with motor fuels up 9.9% from February. That's the biggest increase in 31 years. The cost of restaurant meals, hotels, furniture, clothing and shoes also made upward contributions. The data tells a story of what millions are currently living: steeper bills on everything from petrol to food and fuel, and less left over at the end of each month to put towards their future, said Colin Dyer, client director at fund manager Aberdeen. Gilts tumbled at the open, sending the UK 10-year yield surging 6 basis points to 1.86%. And money markets raised the Bank of England tightening wages, expecting 143 basis points of rate hikes by the end of the year versus 137 basis points on Tuesday. So in total, more than a quarter of the inflation basket is seeing inflation running above 10%. And the retail price index, a measure used to set benefit payouts and interest on inflation-linked debt, rose 9% from a year ago. That's the most since January 1991. When combined with the latest labour market data, the reading gives the Bank of England all the justification it needs to raise interest rates again in May. And the base case is that the Bank of England will pause in the second half of the year as inflation concerns give way to worries about their growth outlook against the backdrop of a serious cost of living crisis. And there was also strong evidence of inflationary pressures building at the wholesale level, with producer prices up 11.9% from a year ago. That's the most since 2008. And raw materials costs surged 19.2%. That's the biggest increase since records began back in 1997. The price of goods leaving UK factories has continued to rise substantially, with metal and transport products both at record highs, and food reaching its highest rate for more than a decade. That's hurting UK retailers as well as households, with supermarket giant Tesco warning on Wednesday that profit may decline this year as it battles to keep prices low for consumers. Retailers are trying to help consumers by expanding their value ranges and doing all they can to keep the price of essentials down, said Helen Dickinson from the British Retail Consortium. And as a result, UK economists are scrambling to increase their inflation forecast after yet another shock reading in March, with many now predicting the rate could approach 9% as soon as next month. And in fact, inflation is likely to accelerate in April, when a 54% increase in energy bills is set to kick in, adding about 1.8 points to the headline rate. Analysts are anticipating prices at levels unthinkable just a year ago, when the rate languished below 1% and the UK was just emerging from a coronavirus lockdown. And following Wednesday's data, the economists have updated their forecasts, with Nomura's George Buckley and Deutsche Bank's Sanjay Raje forecasting levels of around 9%. Alan Monks, an economist at JP Morgan London, also now sees inflation spiking higher, hitting 8.9% in April. And Bank of America economist Robert Wood raised his forecast to 8.8%. Today's inflation report would have done little to quell any inflation fears, Raja said. On the contrary, inflation fears are now likely to pick up further. Inflation is now everywhere, price rises are broad-based and gaining momentum. Inflation at those levels would be well above the Bank of England's forecast, which was at 8%, and it would deepen an already brutal cost of living crisis in the UK that looks set to squeeze incomes by the sharpest pace on record. Worse could arrive in October, when electricity and natural gas bills are due to rise again. That could push inflation into double digits for the first time since the 1980s. And the UK Central Bank is not the only one grappling with faster inflation. Data on Tuesday showed that US consumer prices rose 8.5% in March. That's the biggest increase since late 1981. That prompted Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis President James Bullard to suggest that US monetary policy needed to be tightened to a point that it curtails economic growth, or policymakers will end up risking their credibility. And as I reported yesterday, New Zealand's central bank lifted their OCR by 50 basis points yesterday in an attempt to tame inflation. But I must underscore this once again, because how exactly will higher interest rates fix supply chain disruption, partly, of course, created by the conflict in Ukraine, and how will higher rates help consumers? I suppose those with savings will see some light, but for those with debt and massive debt they tend to sit on, they will be under the hammer in an environment many have never experienced before. Central bankers have largely created this inflation monster. The question is, are they serious about slaying it, or is the truth really that they see high inflation as the only way out to deflate the debt monster? We will see. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.